When Mary Pickford wed Douglas Fairbanks, they were two of the biggest stars in Hollywood. They often hosted lavish parties at their Pickford home, but few saw the dark side of their glamorous life together. And in 1930, a scandal erupted that would finally tear them apart. But we will touch more on this later. The woman audiences knew as Mary Pickford was actually Gladys Marine Smith, and she was born in Toronto, Ontario, Canada on April 8, 1892. When Mary Pickford was just 6 years old, her father hit his head while working on a local steamship, causing a blood clot. 6 months later, he was dead of cerebral hemorrhage. It was a horrific tragedy for the family. On top of that, the loss threw them off the edge of the working class existence into utter poverty. Mary's family was so poor that her mother had to take in boarders to rent rooms in their home. One of those boarders worked in local theater. When he met Mary and her younger sister, he suggested that they take minor roles in his play that he was working on. This was the start of something big for them. Mary Pickford signed a film contract with famed director D.W. Griffith, and before long, she was working harder than any other actress her age. In 1909 alone, she appeared in 51 films, just about one per week. And talk about range. Even though she was just 17 years old, she took on all sorts of roles, from mother to lady of the night. The actor that Griffith had got to rehearse with Pickford that day was Owen Moore, and the teenage Mary had a major crush on him. He became her co-star in The Violin Maker of Cremona, her first starring role. As children of working-class immigrants who got into showbiz with their siblings at a young age, Pickford and Moore had a lot in common. Young love blossomed, but there was one problem. Pickford's mother couldn't stand him. Mary's mother, Charlotte, put her foot down and disapproved of her teenage daughter dating anyone, let alone him. But her mother's disapproval just made Owen Moore all the more appealing to Mary Pickford. And in late 1910, Owen Moore gave Mary Pickford an ultimatum. He wanted her to tell her mother that they were together, and he wanted her to marry him. In January 1911, the young couple eloped together, but instead of a fairy tale, it was an absolute horror story. As Mary, then just 19 years old, walked up to the altar, she knew she made a terrible mistake. The secrecy didn't end with the wedding ceremony. Instead of celebrating with her new husband, Mary Pickford returned to her mother's apartment and snuck into bed, pretending nothing had happened. For a while, she was able to keep up this charade, keeping her marriage a secret from her mother and her regret secret from Moore. But lest we forget, they were all working for the same studio, IMP. It was a house of cards, and it was all about to fall. Soon after her secret wedding, IMP decided to decamp its entire operation to Cuba. That meant Pickford, her secret husband, her disapproving mother, and her two clueless siblings were all about to spend days on a ship together. Mary couldn't take the tension anymore and finally confessed what happened to her family. The reactions were brutal. As Mary's mother sobbed, her sister and brother went stone cold silent for her, and it didn't end there. As soon as the ship landed, Moore went off to drink himself stupid, but this drinking was far from the worst problem in the marriage. Moore was desperately insecure. The fact that Mary was not only more famous than him, but also made way more money grated on him until he became a walking nerve ball. One day, he finally exploded. He attacked an assistant who wanted to press charges, but salvation came from an unexpected source. She may have not liked him, but Mary's mother, Charlotte, came up with a plan to save her son-in-law. She had another IMP actor hide him from local law enforcement until such time that he could find a ship willing to take him back to the US. And Charlotte wasn't just trying to get rid of him, she sent Mary back with him as well. Did Moore learn a lesson from this? Absolutely not. In fact, things got even worse, and he turned his rage toward Mary. On top of his insecurity and his drinking problem, Moore was also physical with Pickford. She hadn't even wanted to tie the knot with him in the first place, and now she was really stuck. While filming a scene that required her to swim in the filthy Hudson River, she was nearly hit by a boat. Then, in her panic, she thought that the man saving her was trying to drown her. Traumatized by the experience, she knew that she had to do something. Mary Pickford told the studio head that she was leaving IMP. Soon after, Moore quit as well, and they both signed with a studio called Majestic. The two had signed Mary Pickford on a plum $225 a week contract and had offered the same to Owen Moore. His fragile ego was soothed, but Mary was hiding a dark secret. She orchestrated his contract, and the studio had only agreed in order to secure her. Mary Pickford had to prove herself to be particularly adept at navigating the studio system in the silent era, but she was still just a girl in many ways. She relied heavily on her mother Charlotte, and it drove a wedge between Mary and her husband. They were rarely alone together because Mary would constantly invite Charlotte to stay with them. It drove Owen mad, but instead of doing anything about it, he'd just go off on benders. Majestic did their best to paint them as a happy couple, but the cracks were starting to show. Mary Pickford and Owen Moore made it through just a handful of movies for Majestic. Their relationship was so toxic that something had to be done, so they went their separate ways from the studio. Both signed contracts with other studios, ending their professional relationship. While this made it to the gossip rags, there was another part that didn't get quite as much publicity. They also separated. It wasn't quite as dramatic as seeking a divorce, but for Pickford, it was definitely a step in the right direction. Mary Pickford could have chosen to go to any studio, but when she looked back on her career, she came up with a surprising conclusion. In her time as an actress, no one else had challenged her as much as the man who discovered her, D.W. Griffith. Pickford wasn't just in it for the paycheck. She really did just want to be the best actress possible, and while IMP and Majestic had paid her well, their films just weren't that great. Pickford decided to return to D.W. Griffith and Biograph Pictures, even though it meant she had to take a huge pay cut. She didn't care, and reportedly, when she saw Griffith again, she collapsed in his arms and cried tears of relief. Mary Pickford both wrote and starred in Hearts Adrift. It made her the biggest star in film, matched only by Charlie Chaplin. It also cemented her status as America's sweetheart, a name that a writer from Famous Players' publicity department came up with. She belonged to her fans, who saw her as innocent, angelic, and pure. Her long, blonde, cascading curls were a symbol of her youth and girlishness, during a period when most women wore their hair up. It's rumored that around this time, Mary Pickford fell hard for one of Famous Players' contracted directors, James Kirkwood. Years later, he confessed to a love affair with the Scarlet, claiming that they'd even discussed marriage. Whether it was true or not, they made a string of successful films together. Unlucky in love but shrewd as can be in business, Pickford saw another opportunity. She got her studio to give her yet another raise. Pickford had an image to maintain, and this, unfortunately, meant she couldn't just ignore her marriage to Owen Moore. They posed for pictures for Playboy, playing the happy couple, but behind the scenes, things were unbelievably dark. Pickford was desperately depressed, and when one of her films turned out bad, it threw her into an even deeper sadness. Thus, she accepted an invitation for a weekend at a friend's mansion upstate, and she and Owen set off, not realizing that they were on a collision course with destiny. On their way up, they stopped to check the map, and another car pulled up alongside theirs. Inside was up-and-coming actor Douglas Fairbanks and his wife, on their way to the same place. Fairbanks' wife quickly accepted Mary Pickford into their circle, but neither knew that he was hiding a dark secret. Douglas Fairbanks cheated on his wife a lot. He carried on multiple affairs, but they were always passing fancies, and he always came home to his wife. He never dreamed of leaving her until he met Mary Pickford. Just as Mary had a good girl image, Douglas Fairbanks had one as a grown-up Boy Scout, and both knew that an affair would damage these images and their livelihoods. Fairbanks moved his family out to California, perhaps to distance himself from the temptation. Sadly, it was a tragedy that brought them together. When Fairbanks' mother passed on, Pickford took him out on a drive to console him. Whether they were having an affair before that is unknown, but one thing for sure is, they definitely were after that night. Soon after, Mary Pickford also up and moved to California. Pickford and Fairbanks snuck off whenever they could, and even when they couldn't. Just as her mother's disapproval had fanned the flames for her teenage love for Owen Moore, sneaking around gave Mary excitement that she'd been missing during her depression. She even bragged about visiting his wife in the hospital, and then grabbed him in the hallway to go off on a date with her. Not something that you should necessarily be proud of. The affair became an open secret in Hollywood. It could have blown Pickford's career into pieces, but there was a pretty big distraction on the horizon. When the US entered World War I in 1917, the government expected Hollywood to do their part. Throughout 1918, Pickford and Fairbanks crisscrossed the US selling war bonds, sometimes appearing together, sometimes in competition with each other. Owen Moore tended to his wounds the only way he knew how, drinking and having public outbursts in Hollywood. Fairbanks' wife Beth waited patiently for him in New York City until one day she hit her breaking point. When Fairbanks visited New York but took a room at a different hotel from his family, Beth's reaction was devastating. She went straight to the press and confirmed the rumors that he'd been having an affair. While she didn't say who, she did go as far to say that it was an actress he had business ties to. All eyes turned to Mary Pickford, who denied the rumors, but the worst was yet to come. If you thought Beth Fairbanks' statement to the press was bad, Owen Moore's was 1,000 times worse. He made it seem like he was defending Pickford's honor, when really, it was as humiliating as it gets. Moore said the other woman is now ill, and talked about how Mary was like a child who Fairbanks had taken advantage of. He finished by saying he planned to sue Fairbanks for interfering in his marriage. It was Mary's worst nightmare come true. The truth was out, and the timing couldn't have been worse. Still, the ever-savvy Pickford managed to sign a lucrative new contract with another studio. The scandal hadn't affected her profitability, and she laid low while Fairbanks was due in court. His wife had demanded a divorce. Instead of filing the court records with splashy details of his affair with Pickford, two of his friends made up stories about dalliances with nameless, faceless women, and surprisingly, it worked. The courts granted the divorce, and the story faded from the paper as quickly as it appeared. The illicit nature of their affair had added a layer of excitement to Pickford and Fairbanks' romance, but the secret was out. If you think it took away any of their passion, think again. Fairbanks relentlessly pursued Pickford, asking her again and again to marry him. It was a true, genuine love, but on the other side of things, Pickford faced a calculating man who was determined to get his way. People knew Owen Moore was moody, gloomy, and generally kind of a dark cloud until news of the affair came out. Then he quickly painted himself as a long-suffering victim and optimistic despite the circumstances. There was a chilling reason for this about-face. The writing was on the wall and there was no way their marriage would make it through, so he wanted a parting gift. Moore demanded $100,000 for a divorce. Pickford was horrified, but money was ultimately a drop in the bucket. Once she agreed to Moore's payday, they arranged a quickie divorce in Nevada. It was easier there than in California. There were still some rules. However, this was America's sweetheart, and as soon as the judge laid eyes on her, it seemed like he forgot most of them. He granted the divorce, and Pickford returned to Hollywood, reassuring the press that she would not only atone for her sins, but would never remarry. Fairbanks once again asked for her hand in marriage. One major fear held her back. If the fans turned on them, would their love be enough for them to live happily ever after? Fairbanks reassured her that they'd be fine. When she still balked, he came up with an unconventional plan. Surprise, no wedding. No, really. One night he invited Mary and two guests for dinner. One was the county marriage clerk and the other was a local pastor. Somehow it worked. Mary protested and insisted that she wouldn't marry him that night. She wasn't dressed for it, after all. However, 2 nights later, she changed her dress and changed her tune. Pickford and Fairbanks tied the knot 26 days later after her divorce from Moore. It was so quick that they announced it to the press before many of their loved ones and had to rush to correct their mistake. When the news broke, the press descended on Pickford and Fairbanks for their scandalous quickie marriage. The Attorney General of Nevada announced he'd be pursuing Pickford for lying during her divorce proceedings. The Baptist Church was up in arms. As for their fans, well, they didn't really seem to buy into the narrative that the couple had done anything wrong. Pickford had prepared for a backlash, but it never really came. In the aftermath after World War I, people in the US and abroad wanted happy news. They wanted a love story, and Mary Pickford gave them one. Timing was everything, and for once, it had worked in her favor. On their honeymoon, fans gave Pickford and Fairbanks a hero's welcome wherever they went. In fact, their scandal had, if anything, only caused their admirers to become more fervent, but some went too far. Well, in England, fans nearly dragged Pickford from a car and a ride ensued. Mary Pickford was the original America's sweetheart and the first female actor, writer, and producer in Hollywood. Now, to cap it all off, Pickford and Fairbanks became the first official Hollywood power couple. Fairbanks gave Pickford a home as a wedding present, and Pickfair, as they called it, became a venue for lavish parties that A-list guests in town attended. They were on top of the world, but for how long? When it came to her relationship with Fairbanks, Pickford had learned some lessons from her first marriage. First, she kept her mother at a safe distance. Second, there was no more on again, off again. For the first 8 years of their marriage, Pickford and Fairbanks didn't spend a night apart from each other. They sat together at dinner parties, and Pickford wouldn't dance with any other man, which once even led her turning down the future King of England, George VI. Pickford and Fairbanks were the king and queen of Hollywood, and Pickfair was their castle. They had guests nightly, sometimes numbering a dozen or more. They also held massive parties with honored guests like Albert Einstein and Helen Keller, not to mention European royalty who occasionally passed through. It's hard to imagine what those dinner party conversations sounded like. Everything in Pickford and Fairbanks' marriage seemed like a fairy tale, but behind closed doors, it was a tragedy in the making. They may have been constantly surrounded by people, but Pickford was terribly lonely. She had few close friends, and her fame had made her unapproachable. And then, there was Fairbanks' dark side. There was a reason why the two were never apart. He was terribly jealous and didn't like it if their male guests even so much looked at her. Not a great sign. Pickford and Fairbanks had been the dominant force in Hollywood for a decade, and no one had come close to their fame. But all things must come to an end. When Fairbanks' popularity began to slow, he grew anxious and desperate. For her part, Pickford finally turned to the bottle like pretty much every other member of her family had. They were growing apart, and making a movie together only exaggerated the problem. He baited her, and even when he didn't, she found his behavior infuriating. On top of everything, the Great Depression had been a crushing blow to the once prosperous film companies of Hollywood. It affected both of their careers, which only made Fairbanks' bad behaviors worse. They had once spent every night together, but now he went off on far adventures for months at a time without her. And he also fell back into his old habits from his first marriage. That's right, he cheated on her. Throughout her 3 marriages, happy or otherwise, Mary Pickford never had any children of her own, only adopting with her 3rd husband. Many have speculated that there is a heartbreaking reason for this. It's rumored that Pickford became pregnant with her first husband, Owen Moore, either in 1910 before they were married and when she was still a teenager, or in 1913 when their relationship was very much on the rocks. But then, why was there no child? Well, Pickford claimed that she suspected an equestrian accident had rendered her infertile. Many think she stopped having a child during her relationship with Moore, which could have been the reason. It was almost common practice for stars to have these secrets during that era, with the studios paying for them and or covering up any evidence. But something much more sinister was about to happen. Pickford's career decline in the 30s was a professional heartbreak, but she was also in for a personal one too. In 1932, her brother Jack visited, thin as a rail. When he said goodbye, she had a feeling she would never see him again. He unfortunately died shortly after, likely caused by his drinking, and the tragedy didn't stop there. 3 years later, Mary also lost her sister to similar causes. The family problem had come back to haunt them all, and now that she was all alone, Mary was its last victim. Her drinking became worse and worse, especially as her marriage to Fairbanks fell apart. Nonetheless, Fairbanks kept crawling back until one day he didn't. He wired Pickford that he wouldn't be returning to Pickfair, then or ever. The news devastated Pickford, but she picked herself up and went to the courts, filing for divorce and citing mental anguish as the reason. She kept Pickfair, and he kept everything else. Then, just as the deal was done, Fairbanks returned to Pickfair and begged her to take him back. He even asked his ex-wife Beth to help him convince Mary, and when the divorce was finalized, he only intensified his efforts. It was clear to everyone that they still loved each other, but Mary wasn't ready to invite him back into her life. She put him off, and he retreated, still sending telegraphs confessing his love. By the time she was finally ready and sent one back, it was too late. Fairbanks had left on a ship the night before to see Lady Sylvia Ashley. Soon after, they tied the knot in Paris. The fairy tale of Pickford and Fairbanks had finally come to a close. After 3 decades of relative seclusion, Mary Pickford passed in a Santa Monica hospital after suffering a stroke the week before. She was just 87 years old. Pickford had been the first to do so many things in film, and the industry honored her for it. Many also shared their stories, good and bad, including some that she'd kept hidden for decades.